welcome to the second part of the conversation with my guest, Professor McCarthy of the English and African American Studies Department. This is the continuation of our previous conversation, which was part of episode 3 of the Black Archive Visual Podcast. And just as a way to kind of, continue the conversation, Jesse, you mentioned that your conception of blackness speaks to blackness as inclusivity. And I wonder if you, would care to say a bit more about that in context of the conversation that we had on the previous episode.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, and it's interesting because to me it does tie back to the point that I make in, the reader's note at the front of the book about orthography and capitalizing the B in blackness. One thing that I think is quite noticeable about blackness, and here one is tempted to generalize, and I think this would be to me a good example of the kinds of ways in which I think we can, make room for a great deal of diversity in blackness and local and contextual specificity, while also thinking about some of the broad kind of interconnective tissue that makes it worthwhile and compelling and often very exciting to think about these things together. And that is, I think, something that we see a great deal of across the Black world in terms of a certain kind of way of approaching, I would say, expressivity and also creativity. And that is that there tends to be an openness to it and an interest in the inclusive. In the African American context specifically, one of the classic examples, metaphors for this, of course, has always been jazz, right? And an art form that takes instruments that were European, that in many contexts, particularly in New Orleans, would have been encountered in martial or military parades, these kinds of contexts, and are repurposed to make a music that's decidedly not very military, right? And create a new and indigenous art form that is incredibly syncretic and reflects in many ways the extraordinary kind of fermentation that a place like New Orleans cultivates over its long period, including its colonial history. And, I think that what you see kind of opposed to that, and here I want to be very careful and specific. When I say whiteness, I actually don't mean ethnic whiteness, or as we sometimes call it, racial whiteness. But what I would consider actually something like ideological whiteness, which is its commitment to the opposite, right, to exclusivity. So you can look at this in terms of the law and the ways in which whiteness is defined consistently by those who cannot be it, right? Whereas blackness, notoriously, is the one-drop rule. It's sort of the opposite. There's almost every conceivable way to be black. And it includes an enormous number of people, an enormous number of cultures, some that ultimately, eventually in the history of America, won't necessarily have a connection even to Africanity or Africa, but who find themselves close because of racialization and proximity to black communities and begin to, in other words, there's a kind of fusional energy, I think, and an interest in creativity that's inclusive that to me, again, kind of ties back and justifies to a certain extent, again, the lowercase b, where again, this lowercase b blackness, to me, does not diminish it. Quite to the contrary, it says that it is an inclusive blackness. Right? It is the openness that is, I think, in part, one of the most impressive and beautiful and sophisticated aspects of that kind of core element that seems to be deeply constitutive of shared black cultures wherever we find them.
No, for sure. And you mention the element of music, jazz, the porous borders of blackness, right? And this reminds me of your essay on Moten in the collection. And one of the things that struck me about that essay is the comment that he makes in response to your response to his asking about how's your dissertation going.
Yeah.
Right? And you say, it's a mess.
Yeah.
And his response, as you detail it in the essay, is not a... Your initial response is to say, it's a mess, I don't know how the hell to make sense of this thing. And his response is to say, embrace that messiness.
Yeah.
Right? Embrace, because that is a unit of measure from where I come from, right? Is what he says. And I wonder, drawing on that, this idea of blackness as messy, of blackness as inclusive, of blackness as this category of being that is able to hold itself but hold others, whether you would agree with the assessment that it is precisely that capacity to be very site-specific and very local, but at the same time very, very global because of the nature of history and the nature of the economy that the world created as a result of the expansion of colonial empires, whether you would agree with the assessment that that is what gives us a true sense of universality, right? Because one of the criticisms that a good colleague of mine levels against, for instance, some of the Enlightenment thinkers, Sabin Ndlovu in that book of his, Epistemic Freedom in Africa, he says that European Enlightenment is incredibly provincial, right? Because it is situated in Europe and it is sort of thinking that Europe is where the world starts and ends. Whereas precisely on this notion of the inclusivity, the ability to be abroad with the other, blackness is always saying, well, how do we understand, situate, relate to? So would you agree with that assessment? And of course, then there's the geographical universality, right? Of the fact that the fact, the existential fact of slavery necessitated this kind of universal spread of these people that we now find all over the world. So would you say that that capacity to be abroad with the other is what affords us that level of universality? And in fact, it reminds me of that concluding essay in Bertrand Russell's collection when he talks about the problems in philosophy and he asks the question of what is the value of philosophy. And he says that true philosophic contemplation, the satisfaction of true philosophic contemplation comes from considering the not self.
Yeah. It's a very, very rich question. One thing that it was funny, in the conversation with Moten, and he said, right, a mess is a good thing to have. A mess is a good thing to have, and to say that, right, is not to say that that he or I or blackness or black thought or black study privileges a kind of disorganized way of thinking or disorganized aesthetic or anything else. But it is to say, right, that we don't, not only do we not necessarily look upon a mess and attribute inherently a negative value to it, but that we're capable of looking upon a mess and seeing what might be advantageous there, right? Of detecting the positive values there. And I think on the question of, provincializing Europe and its epistemic frameworks, one of the things that you consistently see in Kant and Hegel and others is that, it's interesting because the Europeans do have an impressive and I would say even a genuinely remarkable interest in the rest of the world. The efforts to, translate, build up the libraries, one of which we're sitting in right now, in which you can find information, histories, knowledge, collections of literature from civilizations past and present all over the globe is really genuinely remarkable. I don't think it's anything to be dismissed. However, it has to be noted that those frameworks always incorporated those others hierarchically. So it was this kind of it's a universality, but in not in the sense of an acceptance so much as the universality of availability to taxonomy. Right? I mean, this is kind of Linnaeus, kind of universal system of I can organize all of this, provided that it's not messy, it has a hierarchy, and that hierarchy coincidentally has me at the top, European civilization here, and everything else somewhere ranked usually below. Which does seem to indicate, right, a certain kind of incapacity, a provincialism, an inability to imagine a difference of culture, a difference of perspective, a difference of aesthetic appreciation as genuinely, right, forget coextensive, co-equal and perhaps, who knows, maybe even more valuable in some ways than one's own. And I think that that this does seem to be, right, there is this kind of difference there and Moten makes this point that, blackness, and in particular, I would say, the extremely tragic circumstances of the formation of New World blackness through Middle Passage. As Moten would say, we were the first cosmopolitans. And again, not through some kind of, not through elective superiority, but out of necessity. I mean, you have, if you're put on a ship and people were, broken apart precisely because they were afraid of revolts, and this gets to the question of, recognizing people's humanity. They were afraid. They, split people up so that you would have, 4 or 5 different languages side by side. But people still figured it out, right? Out of that mess,
something came out.
Something, and not just something, that's all right, or something that, was good enough. And this I would say is kind of the point of blackness, right? And Moten's point about the positiveness of the mess. What comes out of the mess of the hold on the other side has something very special to offer, right? Has certain ways of doing and practicing sociality and aesthetics and many other things, moral and ethical reflection, that are different to the system that categorized and put those people in the hold. Right, and organized and thought that was, an okay thing to do, and that it made sense and could be justified for these reasons, right? For sure. The thinking, the ideas, the communities, the cultural practices that emerge from the hold on the other end, the mess that comes, the quote-unquote mess that comes out there, has an enormous amount to offer that may, in some respects, perhaps the most crucial ones, I would argue, be superior to the philosophies that put those people in the hold. But much of the history of Western thought has been incapable of even considering, right, that possibility. And therefore we do think, I think we have had and we have seen that there are kind of fundamental confrontations, which ultimately may be part of the working out in history, right, of, I won't say a telos, but of a certain kind of process that is playing itself out, and in which it may be that the future, that we're living through, the moment that we're living through now which we say is so, it's so difficult, it's complicated, and of course it is all of those things. But it might be this very exciting kind of pivotal turning point in human history, where for a number of reasons, we're starting to see the basic epistemic frameworks, the major political philosophies, the major ways of thinking about what a good way of organizing political economy is, the major ways of thinking about what culture and art is for, are being challenged productively precisely because the ways in which the world has been formed thus far have had their blind spots that couldn't be challenged. But now they are. And I would say they have been for a certain time. It's not that they haven't been up until now.
But there's a radicality of that challenge that's being staked now.
There's a building up of steam.
For sure.
Right? And at some point, there's a balance of power. And I think we're seeing, and I think it provokes a lot of anxiety on the other side, right? To see one's preconceptions genuinely challenged and go checked repeatedly when they get asserted.
But I wouldn't even say on the other side only. I'd say even within blackness.
Sure.
Blackness that has assimilated the values, cultural identities, and ways of being of the other side.
Sure.
Right. So, and this is one of the reasons why I think that there is a radical investment in the disavowal of revolutionarily reimagining our society. Right. So, and I guess that's a bigger conversation in and of itself. But I do want to ask this question, and this is an aside question. So I'm hoping we can briefly tackle it. But I wonder, in the context of this complexity of a changing world, the complexity of a world whose ingrained ideologies are being challenged and contested at the very core. And I'm not too familiar with this tradition, so I'm not necessarily going to say I have a particular opinion. But the more time I spend in the United States in black intellectual circles, the more I'm encountering, either in favor or in objection, the concept of Afro-pessimism. Right, and again, it's an aside. So I wonder if you would care to not only assist me, but maybe even our listenership that's not necessarily familiar with that tradition, as they might not necessarily be situated in the American context, to say, well, what is the claim? What is the liberatory claim of Afro-pessimism, and how do we leverage it? Maybe.
Well, in answering that question, I would want to begin by acknowledging that I think my own approach to this question is kind of grounded in a reading of Afro-pessimism that is primarily anchored in its, I would say, perhaps its most popular American theoretician in Frank Wilderson. But that there are, as you know, very important strains, and some would argue precursors really to Afro-pessimism that actually have their origin in South African thought and intellectual circles, which I'm extremely interested in, but less competent to address, and so I want to make sure that I'm framing these things in that way. As regards Afro-pessimism, let's say in a U.S. context, and a critique which I've just known that I've sort of publicly made of Wilderson's work, one of the things that I think is quite important to say at the outset is that. Wilderson, it seems to me, is someone who, first of all, it's worth noting in his own biographical trajectory, begins very much as a man of the left, and I would say even of the revolutionary left. He would describe himself, does describe himself. I mean, his earlier autobiographies as a Marxist-Leninist. He's somebody who is very close and very invested in Chris Hani and the communists in South Africa and who feels and felt, or certainly articulates in his autobiography, feeling deeply betrayed by Mandela and the ANC as having kind of, I think, sort of curtailed, dare I say, even sort of aborted a revolution that he would have liked to have seen through.
Yeah.
The beginnings of sort of his theoretical work that lead to the kind of the articulation of Afro-pessimism, in particular, sort of in his studies, Berkeley on rhetoric and film in particular, and his book Red, White, and Black, which is on cinema, sort of follow in the wake of that earlier phase of his explicitly leftist, Marxist-Leninist commitments, which, by the way, I want to make clear are to me very impressive. Is to say, whatever people want to say about Frank Wilderson, he's somebody who I think exercised a great deal of courage in his life, who put himself on the line. And I'm not going to get into the particulars. I'm not interested in adjudicating his biography. It's just to say that I don't treat him as somebody that I don't respect, as a person for what he's done, for the commitments that he's had over his life, or intellectually. I also respect him intellectually.
Even as you might disagree.
Even as I disagree, right? And so the disagreement, I think, for me, has to do with what I take to be, and he can articulate it better and has done so, and others like Jared Sexton and others around him, I think, make very powerful and persuasive cases on variations of this argument. But he's interested, right, in a kind of very deep analysis of structures of antagonism that he wants to say, rest to some extent on a kind of ontological level, and that these kinds of structures, which are on the one hand ontological, but therefore also manifest, in his view, right, at the kind of level of the unconscious structure of the self, form these dyads, right? And so in order for there to be a conception of the human or of man with a capital M, there has to be a kind of antagonistic, opposite to it. And for him, that's what the black is, or blackness is, right? And therefore, I think for him, thinking about, Afro-pessimism is a way of kind of taking this kind of hidden or occluded kind of premise in the construction of both the modern world and a kind of ontological status of whiteness that gains its force of signification through its antagonistic anti-blackness, and therefore making anti-blackness really foundational and fundamental to the semiotic, the semiological, the ontological structure of the world. And there's much more that could be said there. We don't have that much time, but to quickly say that I think then has also kind of emerged into it begins as a kind of small argument within certain corners of black study, at least in the U.S. context, and but that has kind of gained traction, become more popular, partly through Wilderson's efforts, has gained a kind of wider currency, and part of, I think, my issue here really has to do with, on the one hand, a set of arguments that we can make about sort of the intellectual and philosophical kind of coherence of the view that Afro-pessimism is holding, That's one kind of set of issues. And then, to me, there's this other question of its kind of its discursive potency, because, as I say, right, it's gaining traction, right, and people are responding to it. They respond often quite emotionally or viscerally to feeling finally seen, finally heard, something that gets kind of articulated in an important way that otherwise doesn't get said. On that second part, that discursive part, and I tried to sort of get at this in my essay, I think there's something to that. I think there's something that, the ability to talk about anti-blackness, the ability to talk about a certain kind of specificity that seems to come to the fore when not just racialization in general, but specifically blackness enters into play, is really worth kind of resting with and sitting with. And again, I would say historicizing also, because I think it's interesting, at least, that it sort of coincides to a certain extent. This kind of rise of popularity coincides with the Obama years, and a kind of moment when there's been a kind of very powerful kind of liberal rhetoric around race and the post-racial that I think has its political uses, and that I think Afro-pessimism serves as a useful, in many ways, kind of chastening check on, and which is to say that I'm not at all unsympathetic to the reasons why people are attracted to Afro-pessimism. I think that Afro-pessimism does capture something affective that we otherwise have not had a very we've not done a good job of articulating. With all that being said, I'm uneasy about the intellectual foundations of a project that it seems to me is slippery in where it sort of wants to ground itself. And I'll just say quickly that that's because I think, on the one hand, it doesn't want to completely disavow certain kinds of political usefulness, political rhetoric. It wants to make identity claims that it seems to me can't be taken as sort of empty. They're meant to be made in order to kind of federate and unify and create solidarities for some purpose. And yet at the same time, it's sort of fundamentally sort of post-structuralist in its theorizations, which is to say that materiality falls out, historical specificity falls out, class notably falls out.
And can I just say this?
Yeah.
And again, I might be making a rash and uninformed assessment, but with the falling out of all of those categories, I find myself asking the question of, does the analysis not render itself to a kind of nihilistic kind of position, right? Where the question, as you say, where do we root? Where do we, post-structuralism has a lot of critique precisely because of what post-structuralism does, in the sense of it doesn't facilitate our ability, in any case, from how I've seen a lot of post-structuralists, construct their arguments, it doesn't. And I guess this is the point, right? Tying it back to some of the criticisms that I have of my colleagues in the decolonial tradition, is that folks will tend to want to continuously do the critique and the question as well. What tools are you giving us to invent an alternative world as a result? And to a certain extent, the affective component of Afro-pessimism could be, seen as giving us a framework or a schema on which to develop those tools. But because of the theoretical slippages, we are unable to subsequently marshal those tools in creating that. And again, I say I'm very cautious about my commentary on Afro-pessimism for a number of reasons. The first of which is that I disagree with the South African articulation, the South African precursors
Yes.
to what gives us Afro-pessimism. I disagree with them for a number of reasons. And part of that is the fact that just as a very personal and at a very genealogical level, I come from intellectual histories, both in terms of family and otherwise, that necessarily don't agree with the traditions of Upoqo, etc., as we find it in the PAC, in the Communist Party, etc., etc. And of course, there are criticisms that have been leveled against the Charterist, ideology in South Africa. With the Freedom Charter declaring, curating the country in the ways that it has. But I think that, again, that's a completely big discussion on its own. But what I'm finding, though, Jesse, is to a certain extent what we are all grappling with, irrespective of whatever intellectual tradition we are coming from, is the question of the recognition of the humanity and what in my scholarship I've termed the ontological legitimacy of blackness, right? To the point where in a piece that will hopefully come out with a really cool journal here, I asked the question of whether blackness as indigeneity, for instance, on the continent, can ever possess ontological legitimacy, right? And if we say it can, how does the world look when we begin to imagine the world from the perspective of blackness as indigenous to the continent and that indigeneity having ontological legitimacy and merit? And part of this, goes back to a criticism that we find in Chinua Achebe, right, in the 70s. And he's asking a similar kind of question. So in Impediments to Dialogue Between North and South, which was initially presented as an opening statement at a Festival of African Arts in Berlin in 1979, Chinua Achebe observes that, and I quote, "Let there be no mistake about it. In confronting the black man, the white man has a simple choice, either to accept the black man's humanity and the equality that flow from it, or reject it and see him as a beast of burden." Now, I want to ask you, in relation to that, about something that first essay, it stuck with me, it really did, your first essay in the collection. And whether you can say something to that claim, right, of this equality that Achebe is addressing in relation to blackness. And I think you trouble this as well, not I think you do trouble this, in your outro to that essay, where you're like, well, you have a black artist, but a black artist who becomes a black artist as having had been, the hand of a European artistic master. And you trouble the fact that in order for us to read this black artist, we always read him as the hand of, right? And this is it is on that premise that I invite you to maybe say something to, or in response to, Achebe's demand that the humanity of blackness either be accepted or rejected, and if it is rejected, and I guess in either way we go, whether it's accepted or rejected, what are the implications of either moves, right?
Yeah. There's so much there. I'm going to get to it, but I want to enter into it very quickly, just because to put a pin on the Afro-pessimism, but it'll connect to it through a thinker that is fundamental to this discourse, which is Frantz Fanon. And this is a slight oversimplification, but for the Afro-pessimists, Fanon is extraordinarily important, and the key text, of course, is Black Skin, White Masks, and not so much The Wretched of the Earth. And in a weird way, even if you think about Wilderson's biographical trajectory, I kind of think of it as, he kind of started Wretched of the Earth and then went back to Black Skin, White Masks, sort of reverse order. Whereas I think the original order of the text in Fanon is important. And I think that the insistence on staying in the moment of, look, maman, a Negro, the moment of ontological alienation that Fanon explores in Black Skin, White Masks, is actually a mistake and actually a kind of, I don't want to say an intentional or willful, but certainly a manipulative reading of Fanon, because there is a trajectory in Fanon, and it goes from Black Skin, White Mask, and even in Black Skin, White Mask, at the end of that text, right, even though he explores in incredibly profound and important ways, the psychological damage, the visceral, phenomenological and existential anxiety of that encounter with the white gaze. Even in that text, what does he say? He says we must move towards disalienation. He's not staying in that moment of, ontological despair. He thinks that we do have to, I think he thinks, and I think I agree, that Black people do have to do a kind of, he was a psychologist, a kind of therapeutic work vis-a-vis whiteness.
Which is one of the reasons why that text is taken up so much by psychoanalysts, right?
Of course, absolutely. But it didn't, for him, disalienation didn't stop there. Then the next stop on that road was the wretched of the earth, right? Where we're talking about, however you want to call it, but we're talking about action in a revolutionary guided sense with the wretched of the earth, not just Black people, with all oppressed people to create a new man, a new world, a new society. That's the orientation. I think that trajectory is important, and it's important not to distort the philosophy of Fanon. But to get to your question about this essay, The Master's Tools, which is about Juan de Pareja, who was a Black African painter enslaved and the hand of Velázquez, right, the grand European master of Spanish painting. And one of the ways that I kind of approached this essay when I found out about Pareja, I was just fascinated, first of all, by the kind of the context of this situation, and then looking at Juan de Pareja's paintings and his art, and trying to figure out my own reaction to them. And one of my reactions, and this is sort of, gets to the kind of point about the trap essay, was I was kind of disappointed. I didn't see what I wanted to see there. I didn't see the Blackness that I think I wanted to find. I couldn't, and all that, and a kind of anxiety creeping into me about he isn't as good as Velázquez, and I wish that he was. I want him to be even better than Velázquez. I want him to kind of beat the master at his own game. But I don't quite feel that his paintings do, right? And so I was grappling with my own reactions and what that meant, trying to decolonize to a certain extent my own reactions to his works.
And I see you grappling with this as well in the text.
Of course. And then what happens? You read more, you learn more, and a whole world opens up to me that I had not even considered. Which is the fact that, in fact, 17th century Spain had an enormous African population. Enormous. And there are many reasons to think that there are subtle but important and, in some cases, even unmistakable ways in which the significations of that are, kind of embedded within Pareja's work are speaking to them, to his community. In other words, I was trying to read it against the master and the slave and the white man and the Black man in this Afro-pessimist antagonist, problem and lack of legitimacy. And I had not even, but what had not come into my view was that which is not to dismiss those relations. I mean, after all, it's not that wasn't there. It's just that that's not the whole picture or the whole story. His relationship to his African community, an African community in exile, but reconstituting its own world with its own set of ideas about itself, its own way of practicing community. its own admiration for artists within that community is deeply deeply fundamental to understanding him as an artist, what he was doing, and what he really signifies. And that is, to me, is a sort of parable, a way of talking about what I would say is the importance, not in diminishing, and this, I would say, gets to kind of my thing about Afro-pessimism, I think it's important that we stay with the emotions that it arouses and the impulses that come to the fore and not dismiss them. I don't think Afro-pessimism should be dismissed. I think it should be argued with. We should think about these things all the way through. And if you agree, that's wonderful. If you disagree, that's also legitimate. But we should think about blackness, for all these reasons, has to think about its relationship to whiteness. But that's not all that there is to do. And in many ways, our, I would say, ontological relationship to each other needs to be, and is sometimes, I think, insufficiently what we're paying attention to.
And the observation about speaking to one's community outside of having to respond to the structures of oppression, domination, and injustice bring me to the concluding discussion point of our conversation. And this is inspired by the work of Christopher Miller. The first text, by the way, I must admit that when I picked up, I was absolutely mesmerized by during my time on this fellowship. And the reason why I'm excited and ecstatic and really just, it's an old text. It's Theories of Africans, Francophone Literature and Anthropology in Africa. And that text was published in 1990. But the reason why I'm so excited about it is because for the first time since stepping into the broader global north, elite intellectual space or intellectual communities, I am encountering a northerner who's taking Africa seriously, right? And he inspires this question that I want to ask, and I'm gonna quote from him when he is instructing us on how to read African literature, specifically Francophone African literature. He says, thinking programmatically about Western approaches to African literature leads me to one major hypothesis, around which the rest of this book will turn, that a fair Western reading of African literatures demands engagement with and even dependence on anthropology. Now, I understand him to be making the point in relation to another point which was made by Mazisi Gunene in that essay of his that came out in 1992, where he was diagnosing the problems in African literature, right? And he makes the pointed observation that the English language has been the cause of the death of many of our ancestors, right? Firstly, then, how do we understand the use of language in African American literature? And this will lead me to a second point. So you're giving us an incredible set of amazing essays. And as a literary critic, and I think this is evident in the fact that we have had to, do two segments of this particular conversation, you're inspiring us as a literary critic to think about every aspect of the aesthetic, not just the written word as we encounter it, but every aspect of the aesthetic. And I wonder if African American letters require a certain sense of attention. And I suppose let me just ask my second question, and the second question really comes from Toni Morrison. And that conversation that she has with Charlie Rose, and she's talking about The Bluest Eye, and she says, when I wrote The Bluest Eye, I was yearning for a text that read like Bessie Head's work or Chinua Achebe's work. And the thing that stands out for me, and I had read, your Bessie Heads, your Masisi Gunenes, your Nadine Gordimer's, your J.M. Coetzee's, but specifically more on the black writers, Zoe Wickham and Jabulo Ndebele. They are doing exactly what she says. I'm getting certain scenes in there without having to, I don't know, without having those scenes explained to me, right? And this is exactly what she's saying about that observation of the bluest eye. She says, I wanted to write in a way that didn't require an explanation out. And that then centers this question of, is there a particular way of reading African American letters that relies on a certain level of cultural competence? And I'm inviting here a conversation, an interracial conversation, in the context of North America. So, for a brief second, I'm going to invite a global blackness discourse to take a back seat, but to think about going back maybe to the conversation we were having of always being other in as a way of appreciating a lot more in terms of culture than your own. Would you invite the white readership of the United States, of North America in general, to refine their reading of African American letters?
Well, I think that's what Toni Morrison did in Playing in the Dark. And it's part of why that that book, that essay, is so powerful and so important. And one of the things that that she illustrates there, and I think it's subtle but really crucial, is that the white writers in American history, Mark Twain, Melville, Hemingway, they all were deeply aware and deeply influenced and deeply impressed, in the deepest sense of that word, impressed. That is to say, impacted in their sensibility. Not only by sort of the factual presence of African Americans, but by very specifically their the attributes that they brought to cultural expression, and in particular their contributions to language as a kind of necessary and even crucial ingredient that would make their own literature possible, particularly insofar as the main task, as they saw it, but also hurdle that they were facing, was to create a literature that would distinguish itself in some sense from the European colonial literature of England or the continent. What makes American literature American? What's the secret sauce, the ingredient? When you read Huckleberry Finn, and you discover that in fact Twain modeled much of Huck's language on a black boy that he knew, and you realize how much he's taking consciously and unconsciously to create a new and distinctive and quote-unquote American literature. What you're seeing is, as Morrison very accurately and perceptively puts it, the necessary incorporation of blackness and the African American presence, the Africanist presence, as she puts it, into American literature, that is all the more all the more salient and all the louder precisely for its disavowal. That is to say, they couldn't make the literature without it,
Yeah.
and yet simultaneously the fact that they needed it, the fact that they depended upon it, could not be avowed, and made the disavowal all the more important, and the silence all the weightier upon the fundamental cultural reliance that actually was embedded there. Gail Jones has a wonderful collection of literary criticism called Liberating Voices. And she makes the argument, which I deeply agree with, that one of the signature functions, and you see it in Twain's borrowings already, one of the signature features of African American literature was precisely its interest and investment in orality, and in incorporating with a kind of new linguistic hybridity, and but also fundamentally as a literary innovation, right? Orality as central to the novel as a form, because and to this day, if you talk to European readers and writers, they'll say, "Oh no, that's one of the things that's so distinctive about the American novel." Even when it's an ethnic novel, there's Philip Roth, that sense of voice on the page, Holden Caulfield, J.D. Salinger, The Catcher in the Rye. J.D. Salinger and Roth are getting that out of a tradition that comes out of Twain, that comes out of Blackness, that comes out of the difference that African Americans made to making an American literature that changed the literary and made orality, again, out of that mess, made orality a positive value in a way that, for instance, in French literature, would not be true until probably Céline's Voyage to the End of the Night, which is a novel from the early 1930s, right? So in many ways, is there a need for competence? Well, you could argue that those white writers, they knew what was there. They knew the value of what was there. They just didn't want to acknowledge it. They didn't want to, give credit where credit was due.
Yeah.
But they knew how powerful and potent and important it was. And black writers always knew. And that's part of, by the way, Gail Jones's point, is that throughout the history of African American literature, you see black writers, again, finding ways, in one way or another, to bring orality into the literary discursive page. And that I think says a lot of things, but one of the things that it tells us is that it's not merely a question of competence and who you're speaking to. And it gets to my, that point I was making in a way about reparations and kind of moral reckoning. You have to admit certain things. Yeah. You have to admit certain things.
In the South African context, Nadine Gordimer called it the essential gesture, right? In her literary analysis of the South African culture of letters, as it were. And I guess that becomes the question. And to re-put my question is there a sense in which that essential gesture of not only borrowing, going back to the reparations discussion, so not only taking but also acknowledging where we're taking from and the richness, right, from which we are taking, has that essential gesture been given to a certain extent? Whether we're talking about white writers, whether we're talking about the broader white readership, because and I guess this is the interesting thing, of course, when one finds a colonial settler society like the United States, is that blackness and indigeneity are in the minority. So the readership, really the broader readership, in the country is whiteness. And the question is, has that essential gesture of the readership been realized? Maybe.
We just recently lost Russell Banks. He's a great white American writer, but he's particularly well known for writing novels that were kind of explicitly interested in working class life and working class experience. And in his Paris Review interview, at one point, he says, anyone who writes, I'm paraphrasing, I don't get it exactly, but he says, anyone who wants to write a novel about America and American life, and who doesn't make African Americans, an integral and central subject, part of that project, is dealing with a form of kind of pathological avoidance, right? And I think it's so interesting because we're in a moment when one of the things that people love to talk about is sort of what they can't do, and I'm a white writer, and so I can't write about this, and people will get mad about if I write it this way or that way. I think here's a guy. One is free to critique him. One is free to critique his representations of blackness in his novels. But this phrase, the essential gesture, one thing that it seems to me is at least he gets that part.
Right.
He gets that part right. He understands that what kind of delusion, fundamental delusion, a fundamental not knowing where you are, not knowing who you are, would it take for you to want to be a writer, to want to be an American writer, to want to take America as your subject, and somehow yet not talk about the most fundamental aspects, and be oblivious to that. And so, but one of the interesting things, and here maybe it touches a little on the Afro-pessimism thing, right, is as imperfect, and maybe you would say we like to use the term racially problematic, as Russell Banks may be. Why is it that he is capable of saying that? In other words, it seems to me that, we also can't let people off the hook. If he can say that, other white people can too.
Yeah.
It's not impossible, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's not impossible to at least recognize that gesture needs to be made. And that, again, it's this kind of thing to me where it's like, well, if it's possible, then we really actually need to be thinking about, what's in the way, or what encourages or favors, broadly speaking, everybody, because it's not just white people who have issues with anti-blackness.
No, for sure.
Okay? Not here and not in South Africa. But what is it going to take to come to a kind of consensus, kind of ground reality in which something like the essential gesture is the norm? It's not I don't believe in utopia, right? Like the issue is not, are we going to live in a world free of racism? Probably not, given the human history, right, and the histories of the world. But can we live in a society with a better base norm versus a worse base norm? There's actually a lot to suggest in history that shifts of that order of magnitude are actually possible. And if they're actually possible, then the question of politics, whatever you may think theoretically, whatever you may think philosophically about Afro-pessimism, the question of politics, it seems to me, asserts itself because it suggests that there is, in fact, work to be done. And then the question is, are you involved in some way in supporting that type of a project or not?
For sure. Jesse, thank you so much for a rich and exciting discussion, and I think it's really been quite exhaustive. But before I let you go, I am going to ask you to do a reading for us from your book, and I will give you the freedom to choose where you'd like to read from. But I really do. I thoroughly appreciate our conversation.
Thank you. I think I'll read from a piece that never gets much attention, but that I always liked. It's an essay called An Open Letter to D'Angelo. And, well, it's sort of self-explanatory by the title. And maybe I'll just read from the end. It's sort of partly masquerading, I guess you could say, as a review of his album Black Messiah. Among other things, to praise on Black Messiah is a protest of self-love. In a touching note, we shouldn't overlook D cracks wise. So if you're wondering about the shape I'm in, I hope it ain't my abdomen that you're referring to. What's true of our mistake is also true of our body politic at large. Self-love is something we can work on and recover no matter how badly we've been bruised. Sometimes it's just that you have to go back to find your way forward. The testament of love is what survives us, what the future looks back to, remember in the imperiled hour. Dear D, man, where you been all these years? Promise to tell me sometime about it. It's all good though. Your record is everything it's supposed to be. It's a point of light, shining. We hear you, and we're going back. And we're gonna take the country back too. Fela Kuti said, music is the weapon of the future. Sometimes digging in the crates is where you find the new salvo. But we need you now for real. So do your thing. Be our bridge over troubled water. Your music gives us a glimpse of the world we want to live in all the time, of another life. It reminds us how beautiful the struggle can sound.
Thank you, Jesse. And I think that is demonstrative of what folks will find in this collection, Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul, a deep complexity, a deep nuance, and even as you might disagree with some of the subjects that you treat in the text, I always find a deep sense of deference that is paid to the subject of analysis, whether it be an artwork, whether it be a piece of music, whether it be a towering figure of African American literature and the culture of letters in general. So thank you so much for a deep and rich conversation. Folks, join us again for the 4th episode, where we will continue to discuss ideas of art, music, literature, and culture as we find it in the United States, as well as in the South African context, but more generally of Blackness globally. This has been a rich discussion of the Black Archive visual podcast series, and we hope to see you again next time. It's me, Siseko, signing out. Thank you.